Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and today I was joined by James Montague, Alex Stewart and Seb Stafford-Bloor. Now I spoke to James first, all about Mike Ashley. Mike Ashley's backstory, Mike Ashley now leaving Newcastle potentially if the Premier League okay this bid that's been made for the club by PIF, the Saudi Arabia Royal Fund, and some of the implications of that. I then spoke to Alex and Seb a little bit about moving forwards with Newcastle now. What's likely to happen over the next few months and years? Are we likely to see the same sort of pattern that occurred with Manchester City and the Abu Dhabi royal family? And if not, why not? And also from Alex specifically, if you were taking over Newcastle right now, looking at the team, looking at the manager, what would you do? What would you change? Where are the problems? Who can be kept? And who has to go? I would like to encourage everyone listening to go and get their 90-day free trial of The Athletic. The Athletic is the best place to read about football online. It's ad-free, incredibly high-quality journalism is simply a must-read. And actually, particularly their Newcastle coverage at the moment is of real interest. And we read a lot of that stuff to prepare for today's episode. And we're making some complimentary videos to sit around that too for the Tifo Football channel. You can get your 90-day free trial by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo90. That's the numbers 90. Tifo90. And hey, it's free. Why the hell not? That's 3 months. Go and check it out. That's The Athletic. For the purposes of today's episode, we begin with James Montague and 20 minutes on the backstory of Mike Ashley. Here we go. Okay, James, it looks very likely that, at the time of speaking, that a new bid has come in for Newcastle United. Mike Ashley might be able to finally sell, which I think he's been trying to do for the last 3 years. Would you tell us a little bit about Mike Ashley? Because he's a very controversial figure within football. He's, disliked, I would say, vehemently by the majority of Newcastle fans. Why is that for a man who just used to be a budding squash player?
Well, yeah, Mike Ashley really does provoke a large amount of hatred in people. Interestingly, when you read profiles and interviews with people who are much closer to him, he comes across as a very gregarious, kind of fun kind of guy. I mean, this is a guy who, drunk 11 pints on a business meeting and then vomited into an open fire in a pub. So, if you're willing to, let yourself go in that way in front of your staff, there's a certain, I wouldn't say attraction to working for somebody like that, but it would never be a dull day. But yeah, he took over from Newcastle, paid close to £150 million back in 2007. Of course, he's a billionaire. He's made his money in Sports Direct and various other retail ventures. A self-made man, a self-made billionaire, which is kind of rare in Britain these days.
In fact, in your script that you wrote originally for us, went out about a year ago, a profile on Mike Ashley, I'd forgotten this until I rewatched it this morning, but the £10,000 that his father gave him didn't come from some family allowance. It came from him remortgaging the family bungalow, right? So this is a real self-made man.
Yeah, this is kind of lower middle class guy, went to school, got 1 O-level. You wouldn't think of it by looking at him, but then the same with kind of, if you looked at someone like, say, I don't know, Prosinecki, for instance, they don't look like they ever played professional football, but that's what kind of 80 fags a day does to you. But Ashley wanted to be a professional squash player, couldn't make it, became a kind of certified coach and set up a string of kind of sports retail shops in the home counties, and then parlayed that eventually into this kind of stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap, Sports Direct type of retail empire, which partly makes his profit, a large part of its profit, from also buying distressed brands and trying to, bring them into kind of a unified production chain, and also at the same time by cutting worker wages and conditions down to the absolute bone. And one of the most controversial issues about Ashley has been his allegations of continuous poor treatment of workers within the Sports Direct empire. There was, some of the listeners might remember from a few years ago, there was a big Guardian investigation into one of the big warehouses where workers it was an appalling regime. People weren't even being paid the minimum wage in some places. There was the example of a woman who had given birth in the toilets because she was so scared to take any time off because you were punished for that. The BBC did an investigation into a kind of 6 strikes policy. If you did 6 strikes, like infractions which ranged from going to the toilets, just silly things, using your mobile phone,
talking.
But the biggest thing was he was back then the biggest employer, biggest user of 0 hours contracts. And anyone that's looked at Britain in the 21st century can see that 0 hours contracts, especially amongst younger people, have had a pretty devastating effect on the economic outlook for young people, but also on the country. Just to give your listeners a bit of background, 0 hours contracts, I mean, many of you probably worked on 0 hours contracts, and these are contracts that they're not a work contract. They do not have to offer you any hours whatsoever. So it's not really a proper job. And it's these contracts that have been blamed, especially by, the Labour Party and unions in particular, in impoverishing millions of people, especially since 2010, after the financial crisis and the kind of dawn of austerity. And Mike Ashley has exploited that system to the point where he was actually, he's been brought up in Prime Minister's Questions Time. He has been dragged in front of a select committee, a parliamentary select committee. He's had to apologise. He's had to pay money. He's promised to get rid of or at least give guaranteed hours to his workers. But that hasn't happened. A year later, 2 years later, he's been criticised by Unite. Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party in the opposition, brought this up again, only relatively recently. And then you go to today and, it's not like he's something that he's really learnt from. What happens when we have COVID-19 and, he has to apologise because he wants to keep his stores open, saying that they're an essential service, even though his terrified staff aren't being given any protective equipment. And, of course, he's the first football club to take advantage of the government's furlough scheme, whereby the government will pay 80% of the wages up to a certain level, whereas Tottenham and Liverpool have had to row back on that because of the huge public outcry, but not Ashley. He's not a man, really, who cares that much about what people say. I mean, it's what's best for his business. So this is the kind of man, self-made, ruthless in many ways, but, a real product of 21st century Western capitalism in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, you paint a picture of a ruthless capitalist in his business life. There have been many people who are quoted as saying that Ashley, one of the areas in which he's gone on wrong, or one of the ways in which he's gone wrong, is thinking that he can treat a football club just like any of his other businesses. And clearly that hasn't worked if we look at the evidence at Newcastle United over the past 13 years. But that's what he's like in his business life. What's he like running a football club, and why do Newcastle supporters particularly hate him?
Well, I mean, you say that, but actually, if you look at it, and this is something that comes out a lot with the way that American owners have come into British English soccer in particular, but in the European game as well, that they bring a sensibility of rationalising the business, because football is a crazy industry. We think it's massive, but it's not. It's a tiny industry, really. If you think about the revenue of a football club, and if it makes a profit, which is something that is really only something that was relatively recent for many clubs because of the booming TV deals, the margins are tiny. 80-90%, maybe more of the turnover of a club goes out in wages to players. So it's a completely topsy-turvy business, which is ripe for being kind of rationalised. And a lot of American owners have come in, and Stan Kroenke is one example that I looked at closely when I was writing my previous book, The Billionaires Club. This is a guy who had been part of the franchise system of many different American sports, especially American football, and had built and helped be part of a system that made sure that owners extracted the absolute maximum amount of value from it. And so these guys are coming into the game, and they're now looking at football clubs not as to win glory, not that coming top will necessarily get you the most money, but just doing the absolute minimum you have to survive in the Premier League, so that you keep those sweet kind of TV money, pounds kind of rolling in, and or if you have slightly bigger clubs getting into the Champions League, to keep that kind of flow. So it's about trying to minimise wages, minimise transfer fees, but maximise commercial revenue. But, you know, really trying to keep the lid on outgoings. And in that kind of business environment, actually, Ashley is exactly the kind of person who kind of typifies that, but a very British version of it. And so if you look at Newcastle's finances, I mean, actually, you know, they've actually done pretty well. I mean, they've stabilised, made profits, you know, but that's not why you go into owning a football club necessarily. I mean, you go into a football club because you want your team to win, or the fans want you to win a cup or have a great season in the league.
Could you also make an argument that they've been lucky as well? I mean, they were lucky to have Rafa Benitez, for example, who helped them escape the drop. That would have had a huge negative impact on their finances. Or I mean, or is it really just a case of, you know, depending on your perception of what the purpose of football is?
Well, they did. Look, I mean, they did. It all depends on how your club is set up when you get relegated. And Newcastle were relegated and obviously returned. And it was, you know, Newcastle survived that. But someone like Ashley is, in fact, very, very much the kind of person that is running football clubs, especially in the top leagues in England now and around the world. But he's just a very brash, very recognisably English kind of version of it. But then if you think about the mistakes that he's made, I mean, we can go into, you know, sacking Sam Allardyce. I mean, many people probably don't see that as a mistake, but at the time he had a pretty high reputation. You know, this was a guy who had, you know, he's a bit of a miracle worker, ahead of his time almost, you know. Getting rid of him, changing the name of St James's Park to the Sports Direct Arena, it looked small time, you know. And it made a lot of people wonder, like, okay, why have you bought this club? I mean, of course, it's the biggest advertising hoarding in the world, a Premier League football club. And so, you know, he wanted to benefit from that.
Could you say to a certain extent that actually, given how much Mike Ashley's name has been in the local or the national parlance for the last 13 years, and given how often Sports Direct is mentioned publicly, you know, that there's the old adage that no news is bad news. Do you think it's kind of worked for him in a way?
Well, I was thinking about this today, actually, and yesterday, in relation more to do with sports washing, about how Gulf countries buy football clubs, invest in football clubs and in sport in general, to try to massage their reputation, divert attention away from often the very bad things or the very bad reputation that they might have. And there's a quite good argument that people will say, oh, yeah, well, look, everybody's talking about kafala, like in terms of Qatar, or, you know, I mean, look at Manchester City's reputation. Their owners is terrible. So it doesn't work. So it's obviously not sports washing. Whereas I would actually say that perhaps in our media bubble or kind of social media bubble, perhaps their reputation isn't great because of, you know, it's come out a lot of the stuff they've been doing. But actually in the wider public, it's a very different perception. And actually, in the wider public, Manchester City's perception, I mean, until the UEFA charges were brought about, allegedly cooking the books a little bit to make sure that they kind of hit their financial fair play targets, it kind of still worked. Qatar's a bit of a different kettle of fish because the World Cup is such a big thing that I think it has damaged Qatar's reputation. But I think that the perception of, in our media bubble, of what would affect somebody's reputation and what's out there in the real public, and we see this with elections as well. You know, what's going on, the discussions going on social media aren't the discussions that are being taking place in the country in many respects. And Sports Direct, you know, people are still going there. People are it was still thriving until things outside of its control changed its business. For instance, it halved its profits last year because of Brexit, because because sterling has depreciated by 20%, and that's a huge. If you're a clothing retailer, that's a huge extra cost to be burdened with. And then you're going to have, of course, COVID after that. So it hasn't affected his core business, and so you wonder what kind of reputational damage really happens outside of Newcastle. I mean, this is a guy who not only did he change the name to Sports Direct, but the way to get out of it wasn't to just say, okay, we're going to go back to St James's Park. It was by selling the naming rights to Wonga, it was Wonga that changed the name back as part of the deal. They actually bought the naming rights and changed it back. And this is, I mean, Wonga is now synonymous with the payday loan culture and, you know, interest, five-figure interest on small loans. And, you know, just some of the worst exploitation of the poor in Britain. and they kind of came out of it better than Ashley, which is incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, he looks very likely that he's selling now. Is he going to make any money from this? And what does his exit look like to you, James?
We might see less of him, but I doubt it. I mean, there's going to be lots of other areas where he will be a kind of sheriff of Nottingham type character, and dragged across the coals in the press. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he's going to, if he gets 350 million, he will. I mean, obviously there's loans and all sorts of other things as well, but you know, I think he might make a small profit out of it. But I think it's more the fact that it's been very clear, almost from the second year onwards, that he wanted out, that he made a mistake. He's got in above his head. He's above his head the business of running a football club, on top of all his other businesses. I mean, I remember I visited Dubai, I think shortly after my first book came out about football in the Middle East, and I was doing a feature for 442 about Abu Dhabi and Manchester City, and you know, because no one knew anything about it, they'd just been purchased. And when I was there, Ashley was there as well, trying to hawk the club to somebody, to a sheikh in Dubai. And I remember, I can't remember if it was a picture in the local press or if it was like in the Sun or something, but he turned up and he was in one of these kind of hotel bars, which if anyone goes to Dubai, you know very much, you know, that's where you go because there's no pubs. There are, but they're in hotels. And it was like an outside hotel bar next to a pool table at night, drinking a pint of lager that probably cost 15 quid, you know, waiting for a sheikh to arrive that never turned up. And you just thought, I mean, if you're willing to put yourself in such a public place to get rid of a club, this isn't something you're really going to love and want to nurture in the future. So, you know, I think he'll get the money and he'll thank the Lord that the Saudis have come in and taken it off him, because there's, in this market, I don't know who else would be there with the money that would be possible, would want to take on a project like this.
Just a quick reminder that you can get a 90-day free trial to read the work of our colleagues over at The Athletic, the best place to read about football online. A recent piece, which is relevant to discussions today, is called Along Came Mike Ashley, and it was written by George Culkin, Chris Waugh, Matt Slater, Oliver Kay and David Ornstein. It's actually very long, but I read it a few nights ago, and I think it's fantastic. It really gives you a good insight into the backstory of Mike Ashley and a little bit of more insight into the man himself. So Tifo made a video about Mike Ashley just over a year ago. James wrote the script for that, and we've covered some of that ground again in today's podcast. But what really interests me from the Along Came Mike Ashley piece is that you get a little bit more of a sense of who this man is. And the piece is very balanced in its approach. It details all of the things that we all know about Mike Ashley and the reasons why he is essentially despised by the vast majority of Newcastle supporters and football supporters generally. But at the same time, there's more insight into why some of those decisions would have been made. More insight into the man himself, the way that he comes across to colleagues, peers, rivals, staff members, and fans, many of whom The Athletic spoke to in order to write this long piece. So please do go and get your 90-day free trial. You can read that, all of their other Newcastle coverage at this important time, and indeed all of the local and international national coverage across the rest of the site and across 9 other sports other than football too. So if you visit theathletic.co.uk/Tifo90, Tifo90, you can claim that 90-day free trial and enjoy the rest of your week. Anyway, back to the episode now. Thanks for listening. Okay, Seb, if I can start with you, and I want to ask you this with the caveat that we will talk about the new potential owners if and when that deal does occur. Of course, it still has to go through the owners and directors test, or what used to be called the fit and proper persons test, has to go through the Premier League, who've been put in this quite difficult position where when they say yes or no, there'll be a lot of criticism and sort of political ramifications with both of those sides. So we anticipate that it will be a yes, that this will be official at some point, and Mike Ashley will officially sell the club to the royal family of Saudi Arabia, or the PIF fund, effectively. So, Seb, my question, I suppose, is what are we to expect here? Is this as big as it was when the royal family of Abu Dhabi bought Manchester City all those years ago? Is this the same situation?
No, not really, Joe, because the world has changed. The football world has changed. So we now have concepts like financial fair play, which, irrespective of what people think of them or the rights and wrongs, they are a restricting force on takeovers. So the idea of I think the example I probably use is the Abramovich takeover back in 2004. You couldn't have a situation like that, not least in this instance, because one of the anomalies of Mike Ashley's time at Newcastle is that commercial revenue has not only not grown, it's actually retracted by about £1 million a year. So revenue is an issue for Newcastle. So I think instead of the big traditional splurge, I think what we'll have at first, at least, is a sort of a detoxifying process, a de-Ashleying few months where the physical memories of what Newcastle have been for the last decade and a half are removed. So that includes things like obviously stripping out all of those terrible Sports Direct hoardings from St James's Park. Hopefully, as far as I'm aware, the current shirt sponsor, which is with Fund 88, their 3 years as the club's headline sponsor ends this summer. So there will be a new, probably less offensive kit sponsor. And I think you'll see a lot of things of that nature, probably some work in the community, some sort of heavy-handed PR, because...
there's a blueprint for this now.
I think so. I mean, Newcastle are in a slightly different position. They're not Paris Saint-Germain in the sense that they don't have that kind of that geographical primacy in England. What they can benefit off is a loyal fan base, being by far the most successful club in their region currently. Sunderland remain for the moment in League One, so their catchment area is very large. But they also have that sort of that nest of intangibles that exist in the Northeast, and I think in this initial period the aim will have to be to play to the audience, to present this as a credible football project, and that doesn't just mean marching in an army of very expensive players on poorly thought out contracts, but actually establishing establishing some transparency. You know, what is the structure actually going to look like? If I'm a Newcastle fan, I want to know before any players arrive, I want to know firstly who's making decisions about the team in terms of its structure, who is the sporting director going to be, and also because the takeover is funded from different sources and involves a lot of people who don't necessarily have a very public profile. I think I probably want to know who's responsible for what within this new regime, who looks after the commercial interests of the club, who is going to be the chief executive, who do I blame when things aren't as they should be? Because as we know from the past, when new people come into a football club, there can be a sort of a 6 to 18 month period of madness where everyone gets a little bit overexcited with the new toy and inefficiencies result. So yeah, transparency, marketing, de-Ashleying, these are the commodities at the moment for Newcastle, I think.
I think if we do take some sort of comparison to the situation at Manchester City, which I think is fair because it seems clear to everyone that this is a sort of opportunist act of what has become known as sports washing by a Gulf state with a history of very poor human rights abuses. That's clearly what it is, right? So if we can take some comparison there, the structure and the clarity are things which you don't have at Manchester City. You know that Khaldun Al-Mubarak is the chairman, for example, but it really isn't clear. You know, even to take it back a stage, it really isn't clear who the actual owner is. And so in this case with Newcastle, the bid has been made. I think 10% of it comes from Amanda Staveley, who sort of spearheaded the deal and helped forward the negotiations. She was also part of the Manchester City deal with Abu Dhabi, but the bid comes from the Saudi Arabian Royal Fund, or it's called the PIF. So the clarity around who actually will own the club, I don't think will ever be there in the same way that it isn't really with Man City. And the other thing I would say in response to you is I agree about the point about FFP. It's certainly a lot harder to do, and it's impossible to do what Abramovich did at Chelsea. It's a lot harder to make headway nowadays. However, I think if you're working at UEFA, you're probably thinking this is not great, because suddenly you're in another situation where whatever the rules say, your opponent in the FFP realm now has infinite amounts of money in the same way that Man City do. And so if those emails that were leaked from football leaks are to be believed and are true, then that attitude of, we will spend millions and millions of dollars and take UEFA to court for 10 years rather than to submit to their will, one would assume that would be the same potential outcome. So I think that, sure, FFP does restrict them a little bit, but do you not think that they'll be certainly seeking ways around that, particularly if sort of sponsorship slots are open immediately?
Yes, of course. I mean, also, this is a post-Manchester City versus UEFA world. When we're recording this, we still don't really know what the Court of Arbitration for Sport's next move is going to be. So we don't actually have a definitive outcome. But UEFA is, I wouldn't say wise to these little tricks, but aware of their existence. I think what's also relevant is the chief executive of Paris Saint-Germain is on a UEFA's executive council. And what tends to happen when a new club, or what traditionally has happened, when a new club becomes wealthy overnight, it breeds resentment and it breeds competition. It would mean that, sort of the royal family of Qatar, as in Paris Saint-Germain's case, they tend to shut the doors. And so you've got to account for whatever lobbying is going to happen within UEFA as a result of this, because teams like Paris Saint-Germain, Manchester City, to a lesser extent Chelsea, these are not sides that are going to surrender their financial primacy easily. And particularly in Manchester City's case, on the basis of how much duress, rightly or wrongly, they've been placed under with regards to FFP issue, they're going to want to see similarly strict application to any new side, and that includes Newcastle. Just one other thing, Joe, when we talk about transparency, I mean, I don't want to speak for fans, but I have been paying attention to the reaction of the Newcastle public to this news and the impending takeover. Now, I think what matters in terms of transparency to the majority is not who owns the club in what percentages. That's an entirely different situation. I think what matters to them at the moment is going to be who makes decisions pertaining to the club. So Manchester City are probably a good example there, because everyone knows the flow of footballing power within the organisation. Chicky Berigstein is obviously a chief executive. Ferran Soriano, we know his views on the way football should run. I'd recommend anyone to read his book if they haven't already done so. It's kind of an absolutely terrifying vision of the future. It's like football's 1984. It's pretty macro, to be euphemistic. So I think that's what matters. They want to know, right, that central midfielder that my team needs, who is identifying him, who is negotiating a price for him, and who's offering the contract. And that's the kind of transparency I think we're dealing in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen. Obviously, as we said before, I'm going to keep making this caveat because I want to assure people that we are going to focus on the new owners. The fans will have other things to worry about too, and those are things that we're already seeing people talk about. It's a very confusing and difficult situation for supporters. But these things are going to happen, presumably, right? So, with that in mind, Alex, I would like to ask you what you think of Newcastle, broadly speaking, as a team on the pitch at the moment. I mean, they play quite a distinctive style in the Premier League, which I'm going to call heavily defensive. Is that right? And presumably, if that is right, do you think, from a sort of PR perspective, that's something they'll be seeking to change?
Yes. It has to be. I mean, one of the things that rich owners seem to want to demand when they come into a club is entertaining and attacking football. This was obviously to go back to Abramovich, who Seb cited earlier. That was one of his promises with regards to Chelsea. I think in terms of building a stable revenue base, yes, Newcastle fans are going to turn up to St James's Park irrespective of the quality of football, because they're that kind of fan base. But the more you can generate attacking and exciting football, the more stickiness there is to that proposition. And obviously in terms of the likelihood of achieving European competition, which, is apparently part of their aim, to turn Newcastle United into a Champions League club, they're not going to achieve that with the kind of football that they're playing. I mean, they They are heavily defensive in terms of goals scored. Only Norwich, who are bottom, have scored as few goals. And actually Newcastle have managed to do that on slightly less XG as well. So from an attacking perspective, they are clearly the worst team in the Premier League. They're 13th on the basis largely of their defensive performance, although a huge amount of credit needs to go to Martin Dubravka, the goalkeeper, for that, because Newcastle's XG against is significantly higher than the number of goals they've conceded. So Dubravka is almost certainly responsible for keeping out shots that really should have gone in. If they had a different goalkeeper, then Newcastle would be very definitely a relegation candidate. The football is very stolid. It's very dull. There's quite a lot of long ball. They are quite high up for dribbling numbers and take-ons, but in terms of actually getting the ball successfully into the final third, they're in the bottom 4 or 5 clubs in the league. So there's a huge amount of work to be done.
How long until we say goodbye to Steve Bruce? Which I say, I love Steve Bruce. I think he's great. But presumably,
I'm going to challenge you on that, Joe. Where does your love for Steve Bruce come from?
From his personality, from his sort of character, from he just seems so sweet and nice, and I want to be around him.
Mentally, I'm trying to connect this to Robbie Brady somehow, because I'm sure that's where we're heading.
It doesn't connect in the same way. But Steve Bruce, I just think he's such a nice man. Basically, I don't know him. I might be completely wrong. My impression of him is that he's one of football's nice men, and so I say that with a heavy heart. But presumably, Steve Bruce, it's already ticking down.
Oh, it has to be. I mean, Steve Bruce is the kind of person that you bring in to stabilise a club, which I think he has done. He's a defence first and foremost kind of manager. I think the issue is that Newcastle do have some relatively exciting attacking players in Almiron, Alan Saint-Maxime and Joe Linton, who we've looked at in a video previously. But Bruce is not really... He doesn't appear to have a great idea of how to use them. If you look at the last 5 games that Newcastle have played, which does include an FA Cup game, there's been a variety of different formations used. So he's tried 3 at the back, with Lazaro, who's a loan signing from Inter Milan, as a right wing back, and Matt Ritchie as a left wing back, which allows Saint-Maxime and Almiron to kind of tuck inside, which I think is probably quite good for them. But he's also used a 4-4-2, he's used a 4-4-1-1. So there doesn't seem to be much of a template beyond keep it solid at the back and try and hope for a moment of individual brilliance from one of these dribblers, ball carriers, to get goals. It is easier to work on defence, but that's not necessarily a criticism of Bruce. I think the issue that they've got is first and foremost it's goals scored. I mean, their leading scorer in the Premier League is John Joe Selvey with 5. The attacking unit is not contributing significantly. And I think I'd really echo Seb's point here in terms of if there's a sudden cash injection into the club and there are clearly question marks around an area of the pitch, and let's not be too harsh on Newcastle. They actually have the makings of a decent squad there. They have some outstanding players in certain positions, but what you don't want is somebody coming in and saying, right, there's £200 million in the transfer kitty, go and buy some people, without knowing what the kind of chain of accountability there is. What is Newcastle's scouting system like? For a long time, Newcastle were held up as one of the more advanced kind of scouting systems on the basis of Graham Carr's work in France, where he uncovered a number of really, really strong players who came over, did well in the Premier League for Newcastle, and then were sold on for reasonable money. Now, that pipeline has dried up, and while I would say, for example, the acquisition of Joe Linton is a very sound one, and I know a lot of Newcastle fans will disagree with this opinion, but Joe Linton is a very good player. He's just being used badly. You don't want to go and spend 50-60 million pounds on a striker if it's not the right striker for the system. So,
are you saying they shouldn't sign Robinho? How long until they do? Is that a fair comparison?
Well, no. I mean, Robinho is a funny example because he was very up and down. But I think what Newcastle need to do first and foremost is start from scratch. They need to say, okay, what is the style of football that we want to play? If we want to play that style of football, who is the manager that we bring in to support that with a director of football overseeing that process? The director of football should then be responsible for looking at transfer targets that complement that overarching style and also have a list of managerial replacements in case that manager doesn't work out. But you want, a takeover is always the opportunity to begin this squad building process from scratch. And it's not like Newcastle have, like I say, a duff squad. Sam Maxime, very, very exciting. Fabien Cher, one of the really underrated central defenders in the league. Florian Lejeune, likewise.
Lascelles I put in that bracket as well. I would keep Lascelles. I think he's
absolutely.
I
would definitely keep Lascelles. I think Dubravka is an outstanding goalkeeper. Matt Ritchie is a very flexible player who can play in a variety of different positions. They've got some decent stuff to build on there.
You know what's really interesting, Alex? Because you were talking about sort of the way they attack. I've reported on Newcastle a couple of times this season, and the aesthetic is really weird. It's like, with Sam Maximan, it's as if every time he gets the ball, the idea is for him to score the greatest goal in the history of the game, because Bruce's tactic seems to provide him with the opportunity to pick up the ball maybe just inside his own half or just beyond the halfway line, and then he's encouraged to take 7 defenders on and hopefully he'll score a goal. And that seems to be what amounts to a counter-attack in Bruce's game plan. So if you were
I that's absolutely right. That's why their
weird,
numbers for dribbles and take-ons are so high, but their end product is so poor.
It's a safe counter-attack, right? If you only send one player forwards.
Yeah, but conversely, sorry, I wandered off topic, but it's interesting because if you were to say, right, we've got Joe Linton, Sam Maximan, and Almiron, call that a notional front three and organise it whichever way you want to. But if you were then to stack it in front of a midfield who could actually control the ball, I wouldn't call that an elite unit. I wouldn't say that they're about to, infiltrate the Champions League places, but that's a very useful and interesting attacking side. I'd want to watch that, for instance. It would be entertaining because those are that's a pretty flair heavy group of players.
Yeah, if I were Newcastle, the first thing I would do is look to get a striker. I think we've seen with Joe Linton that he is most effective when he's paired with somebody else or potentially when he's operating out wide. So I think if you had Almiron in the 10 role, Sam Maximan and Joe Linton on either flank, and they could swap during the course of the game, to be fair, that what they all need is somebody to play off.
We're going to talk about Salomon Rondon, aren't we?
Well, I mean...
one of the greats.
Someone potentially like that. Yeah, but it's that sort of player. It's somebody who can create space for others, who can hold the ball up.
Odio Nagalo.
If you've got a midfield double pivot of one of the Longstaffs plus John Joe Shelvey, who I think if his head is in the game is still capable of
big old Biff.
Well, I mean,
he's a
John Joe
fabulous player. I think he's so gifted. But you're absolutely right. He's such a give him somebody else's brain.
He blows incredibly hot and cold, doesn't he? But when he's good, he's superb.
Yes.
And if you look at Newcastle's current striking options, you've got Yoshinori Muto, who's basically done nothing and has had injury problems. You've got Dwight Gale, who is an excellent championship level striker, but has struggled in the league above. And Andy Carroll,
who's out of contract in the summer as well. So we're going to
and is persistently injured, and so if you could start with that, and normally I would. I'm very hesitant to advocate spending big money on a striker because strikers it's the most overvalued position. It's the one where it's hardest to find the right sort of quality. But if you were to look at that, maybe an upgrade at right back if you can't sign Lazaro. I doubt it's a loan to buy option because, Inter are the sort of club that will play through at the back and will want a really high quality right wing back, and Lazaro is that and will become that. So, I think there's a couple of areas to strengthen, but if I were Newcastle, the first thing I would do is be looking to get people like Dubravka, Cher, Lejeune, Lascelles on big long-term contracts, and really kind of solidify the spine of that team, and then make one or two careful acquisitions to complement that. And yeah, I think if they had the right manager with that squad, they're not going to be challenging for a Champions League place anytime soon, but they can start to incrementally work their way up the table while playing more exciting football, which surely is what Newcastle fans want.
Okay, well, listen, we don't know when football is coming back, so there's probably not much point speculating on the timeline for when these things occur. It is an interesting time for a deal to go through, particularly when clubs are struggling so much. And one of the things I'll be curious to see is if this deal does go through before the end of the lockdown, for example. I wonder how the new owners will deal with the situation of non-playing staff currently being furloughed at Newcastle, which is a decision which has been made and reversed by Tottenham and Liverpool and was considered by some other clubs and not made. So I wonder if that's something that we'll see reversed initially. But it strikes me that this conversation generally is just a very confused one for obvious reasons. The way that we work at Tifo is, with Alex, we look at the squad itself, we look at the team, we look at the tactics, we look at the sort of pragmatic decisions that can and can't be made to change the outcomes on a football pitch without considering the wider context most of the time. With Seb and with some of our other writers, we try to examine that wider context, and we try to keep an eye on the moral issues too. So, I guess what I'm saying is that for supporters of Newcastle, this is a very, very confusing time. And I'm going to ask you an impossible question to answer, Seb. If you are a Newcastle supporter and you've just had 13 years of Mike Ashley, which has sort of derided your not love for the club and for the badge and whatever, but your love for attending the club on a day-to-day basis, and the despair at watching the stale and stolid way in which that partnership has worked out. On the one hand, you're feeling sort of jubilation that Mike Ashley is going to leave, and on the other, you are aware that the new owners are, responsible for some of the worst human rights violations that we can see in the modern world. I mean, that is not an exaggeration. It takes a cursory 5-minute look online, or you pick up a newspaper. You will see the sort of human rights violations and the crimes that are ongoing, abdicated by the leadership in a Gulf state like Saudi Arabia. So, how do supporters rectify those two things? How do you not do what we've just done, or can you, which is to talk about it a bit and then go on and talk about the actual football? Because ultimately that is what is going to happen. Does that? I know that was a winding way of getting there.
No,
but that makes sense, right?
Yeah, but Joe, I think that we need to take a long winding way to get there with these questions, because they're really conflicting. So last week I was writing an article for another website about what Newcastle need to do from a footballing perspective, what their next steps should be. And I remember talking to the editor about it, and she said, we want to do that. I said, well, how can you skip through to that without seeming like you're ignoring the obvious? And I think a good rule, my big thing here is, in the first instance, I don't believe fans should be held accountable for the actions of their owners. I don't believe that fans should be answerable in any way. And nor do I believe, unless you're in this situation yourself. So I'm a Tottenham fan. So say the situation's presented itself at White Hart Lane, a similar ethical dilemma. If I myself have not made the decision to say, right, that's it, I've had enough of this club, I'm turning my back, I don't really have the right to demand that of somebody else, of another fan. Because A, I have no idea what it is, and B, to preach that is to misunderstand what fandom is. That being said, I think there is a line between not holding people accountable and then tolerating the kind of apologism that we've seen in the past. So if fans are aware of it, then that is their business. What I don't really agree with is these warrior cells that develop. We've seen this with Manchester City in the past. It happens a little bit with Paris Saint-Germain too. We notice it less because it tends to happen in French, obviously. But you get these people that all of a sudden they become Wikipedia experts on human rights abuses in the Middle East, because it is their club and they sense that it is their obligation to be that person. They think it's a sort of a branch of fandom. I don't believe it is. I will not sort of demand that any Newcastle fan does that. And I'm not going to collar a Newcastle supporter in the street and say, right, well, you know, your club is now owned by these people. Here's my long list of grievances and ethical issues that I have with those people. Explain yourself. It's not the fans' position that. And so what you're left with is this really difficult territory where it feels like even from a journalistic perspective, even if you want to write about a purely sporting issue at Newcastle, at the moment there's this weird implied obligation that your first paragraph has to be full of these asterisks that sort of identify you as someone that knows what this is, knows is fully versed in the kind of the practices of sports washing, but has to talk about the football as if they're playing dumb anyway. It's very, very difficult, and pretending otherwise is disingenuous. And
well, I would add to what you say there, Seb, though. I mean, I agree with the majority of what you've said. I think one of the issues that we have when situations like this arise, and this is very noticeable as it relates to Manchester City and certainly other clubs around Europe as well, is that owners have realised that when they buy a Western football club, they're also buying a kind of online army of people. Yeah. And that this
Without
absolutely does
right.
not relate to all supporters, and I would never suggest that it does. But it is absolutely clear that there is a certain strain of supporters who support particular clubs owned by conflicted and complicated ownership structures, who then take it upon themselves to defend those owners at every possible opportunity, and often use the kind of whataboutery to do so. And that's something that has not gone unnoticed by people who are seeking to use sports to sports wash whatever it is. And I think, of course, you're absolutely right. Fans should not be blamed for the owners of their clubs. At the same time, fans should not actively defend them against all other things, right?
No, I completely agree with you, and that's where the line exists, Joe, because you're absolutely right. What some people have identified, particularly people who are investing in English football clubs, is that you do get these sort of battalions. It's a kind of a privilege of owning a football club. But then that in itself is really nothing new. If you look back at sort of various controversies, which don't even relate to, takeovers. I mean, I remember, for instance, the Luis Suarez controversy, the Patrice Evra incident.
Yeah.
And I think that's just as abhorrent, this practice of excusing things on account of what the guilty party did and what colour shirt they were wearing at the time. I completely disagree with that. So all I can base on at the moment is this small group of Newcastle supporters who I interact with online. And the consensus between them seems to be, and I don't pretend this is, any meaningful sample, but the consensus among those seems to be these people are guilty of terrible things, and I'm aware of that. And this is my football club, and I have a vested interest in that. I have been there for longer than these owners, and I will probably be there after they've gone. Now, their struggle is to try and keep those things in separate compartments. And having never been in that position myself, I don't know. I can't speak for how difficult it is. I think it's self-evident. I think it's a very trying process, and I think anyone, I don't know. I'm fine saying that I don't know, because we are still coming to terms with these things and trying to properly understand them. And in my mind, just in my opinion, this is a kind of a new low watermark in the who owns football clubs debate. And so we're really entering uncharted territory. So I don't think there's an answer. I don't think there's a silver bullet response to your question. But I think that's okay. I think that as long as we keep debating these things and there's awareness of what is represented by the actions of people that own football clubs and that the extent of that authority, I think that's the crucial detail, Joe. It's people getting to terms with people who grew up with football in the 70s, 80s, even the 90s, when it was still, it was still fairly provincial. These are no longer those entities anymore. These are multinational, hugely powerful tools which are being manipulated by people. And I think this is this is just part of that ongoing conversation and awareness.
Yeah, it fucking sucks, doesn't it?
It's really difficult, man. Like, it's like writing about it. I don't expect anyone to have any sympathy with it, but it's a little bit of a minefield. Like, you set out writing and you're thinking, I don't want to give anybody the opportunity to pretend that they think that I'm ignoring this, or vice versa. You don't want to be accused of being the person that says, right, well, you've been supporting Newcastle, since the 60s and 70s, and now it's owned by these people, therefore you are those people. You have to find the midpoint between those. And it's difficult.
Okay, well, on that sort of sour and depressing note, we will end. As I said, with the caveat that we will return to this topic. We're going to bring James Montague back to discuss this in full and discuss all of those aspects that we were just talking about there, the sale itself, some very interesting characters who enter into that, Amanda Staveley being one of them, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is at the centre of a huge number of controversies and is also ultimately the owner of the PIF fund, which now owns Newcastle, well, which will own Newcastle after it goes through. So there's lots to discuss there, and lots of interesting stories. We will come back and do that in full. We're just going to wait for it to become official before we release that podcast. But thank you very much for listening today. We will be back on Thursday. Alex and I are discussing what are we discussing, Alex?
You haven't actually told me yet.
What's going on Thursday?
I don't know.
Oh, we're discussing parking the bus. Parking the bus.
Parking the bus.
We're discussing parking the. Sorry, I forgot about that because who cares about parking the bus when the world is at stake? No, that's fine.
It's a new era of organisation, this.
I know, it really is. The best thing is that we organise earlier now, but subsequently I forget what we've organised. Anyway, we will be back on Thursday with that. Next week we will be back with another thing, which is as of yet to be organised. What a rambling way to end. Alex, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Seb, much appreciated.
Thank you, Joe.
Great, and au revoir to all.